All right, so we're back for part 2 of our onion fertilizing video. If you didn't see the first part where we set up the EZ-FLO injector so we can fertilize through our drip system, I'll put a link up top so you can check that out. Now, I say this all the time, but I'll say it again. The keys to growing big onions are planting them early as you can plant them for your respective planting zone, giving them plenty of water, which we can do using the drip irrigation system, and also giving them plenty of nitrogen. Onions, and all alliums for that matter, are heavy feeders, so we got to keep them fed. We got to maximize that vegetative phase. We've got a lot of alliums in this plot we've got to feed today. We've got some leeks there. They're getting close. Got those healed up real tall, but they could probably use one more shot. We've got some shallots here, which have a ton of vegetation on them, and those are growing good, but they need some fertilizer. We've got our elephant garlic here, our 3 double rows of elephant garlic. They could use a little pop. And then we've got onions here. These are some Texas Legend and Sweet Harvest onions that I grew from transplants. And I put these in the ground at the beginning of November, so they're a little bigger than these onions that are down the line. One more row of leeks there that were put in a month or so after that row you saw before. Here we've got our onion plants that we got from Dixondale. Some 10-15s, some white onions, some red onions. There's about 7 rows there of onions that we got from Dixondale. And then over here, there's 2 more rows of onions that I grew in seed trays. They're coming along nicely. And then finally over here, we've got these leeks. You may have seen me plant with a broad fork in a previous video. They're just starting to kind of take off and grow. So lots of different stages of growth with these alliums here, because I kind of stagger planted them, you know, starting in late October, early November, and then just planted a few rows here and there all the way through November. Now let's talk about what kind of fertilizer we're going to be giving our onions. So this here is our ammonium sulfate fertilizer, 21% nitrogen and then some sulfur in there. And this is what we feed our alliums once they get up and going. We give them 20-20-20 or a balanced fertilizer to start, and then we start feeding them this high nitrogen stuff here. And as you can see, it's in a nice little granular formulation there, so you could use it for side dressing, but it's also water soluble, so we can inject it into the drip system. Now you might be saying to yourself, Trav, I understand the nitrogen part, the 21% nitrogen, but what does the sulfur do for onions and other alliums? So sulfur is what gives onions their pungent flavor. It also is what makes them very nutritious and healthy to eat. So onions that don't have a lot of sulfur aren't near as nutritious or good for you as onions that do have sulfur. And if you're like me, you like your onions to taste like onions, not just a big ball of water. So adding that ammonium sulfate is going to make sure we've got some nice, bold, really good tasting onions. Now we could certainly side dress with this ammonium sulfate. Like I said before, we could come along here and sprinkle it alongside those double rows and take our wheel hoe in there and cultivate to kind of bury it a little bit, and that would give us a nice slow release there. But I'm wanting an instant pop, so I'm going to dissolve it and shoot it through that drip tape. Now the rate on this stuff is 1 cup per 20 linear row feet, and that's if you're side dressing, where it's a little more slow release action. Putting it through the drip system is doing what we call spoon feeding, so we fertilize more frequently but at a lower rate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that rate in half, and I'm going to do 1 cup per 40 row feet instead of 1 cup per 20 row feet. And I've got about 21 rows here, and from my estimations I'm going to use almost this whole 10-pound bag. So let's walk over to the well and dissolve this fertilizer and get this show on the road. Now the neck on this fertilizer injector tank is a little narrow, and so it's easier if you dissolve your fertilizer in a bucket or something and then pour it into the tank. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to take my fertilizer, dump it into the bucket there. I'm going to take my wand and add some water and mix it around and dissolve it. Now I got to be sure not to add too much water because this tank here can only hold 2 gallons. So we got to get this dissolved and then we can pour it in the tank. Now I couldn't get quite all of it to dissolve, but enough of it. and that agitator in that tank there should help dissolve the rest of it. So I'm just going to take my mixture and pour it into my EZ-FLO tank. And then the last thing I'm going to do is take some of our micro boost and put in there, and that will give it a little color and let me see that it's injecting through the tank. This ammonium sulfate is fairly clear, so you can't see it as well through the line as you can, say, that blue 20-20-20. You could also put food coloring in there, but I like this micro boost here. It helps it out, gives those plants some of those micronutrients they need. So I'm going to put about 16 ounces or so of that in there. And you want to make sure you go ahead and fill this tank all the way up with water or your fertilizer solution. That way, once you turn it on, it can start siphoning fertilizer. If you don't, you're going to have to wait for it to fill up with water. So go ahead and fill it all the way to the top there. And then we're going to get our cap and put on there. And the best way I found to do this is to just kind of get this thing going, or get it threaded, and then just twist the tank and spin that lid until you get it nice and tight. And then we've got it on our fast setting there. We want to make sure these inline valves are turned off initially until we get everything going. Okay, now here's the part where you really need to pay attention. All right, so this isn't very complicated, but there are a certain sequence of events you got to follow here, and I'll go through them. So we've got our spigot on. We're going to switch this valve. This is the hose that's running to our drip irrigation system on our onions. So we're going to turn that on, okay? And that's not doing anything with the tank right now because we've got both of the inline valves on the tank shut off. So it's just watering the garden like it normally would. Now let me show you how I've got this set up down here. So I've got two garden plots right here that are fed from the same water hose. We've got our alliums over here, which we want to fertilize today, and then we've got some English peas and all this lettuce that we don't want to fertilize with ammonium sulfate. So my water hose runs here to my filter, my pressure regulator, and then the main line splits off, and I've got a valve running to this lettuce over here, and then I've got another valve that runs around here, and then that's going to feed this allium plot. So I've got the valve for the lettuce and the peas turned off, the valve for the onions turned on. So we're just going to fertilize this plot right here. And so what we're waiting on here is for these drip lines to expand and start putting out some water before we turn that injector on. So we can see there that emitter starting to look a little wet, starting to put out some water. So we're just waiting on all of that pressure to kind of equalize through the system here, and we'll be able to tell when these drip lines fully inflate. And when that time comes, which won't take but just maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute, we'll walk back over there and turn our injector on. All right, all of our drip lines are inflated or filled with water. Now it's time to turn this bad boy on. First thing we want to do here is flip this inline valve right here on this black line. That's going to start shooting water into the tank and create some pressure within that tank. So we want to do that, and you can hear it when you turn it on. It starts shooting water into that tank. So that black line is coming off that hose bib, pumping water into that tank, into that little agitator piece inside there. And I usually like to wait about 30 seconds or so before the next step. And once we've got that pressure building inside the tank, we're going to go ahead and flip on the valve for our actual injection line, this clear line here. So I'm going to switch this valve here. And then we just wait. Usually doesn't take too long. Sometimes it can take up to a minute. We'll just wait till we start seeing that dark colored fertilizer zipping through that clear line there. You can start to see some bubbles going through there, which is always a good sign. And then once it gets going, you'll see that brown fertilizer mixture there zipping through that white tube. If we follow it all the way around here, injecting back through that hose bib, down through our water hose, and down to the garden. So adding that micro boost in there just helps us see it, going to help those plants as well. But like I said, if you're not using a colored fertilizer of any sort, you can put some food coloring in there. Just give you an indication of if it's working or not. Now the next thing you're probably wondering is, how long does this take? How long does it take for that tank to become diluted so we know we've given all that fertilizer to our plants that we have on those rows of drip tape? And from my experiences, that's going to depend a lot on how much drip tape you're fertilizing at a time. But with, for instance, these 20 rows, 20 40-foot rows that I'm fertilizing or injecting today, it's going to take about 4 hours for that tank to become diluted. Now, it will never run completely clear. It will still have a little bit of a brownish tinge to it, but it's as diluted as it's going to get, and you can pretty much assume that all of that fertilizer has been delivered through those drip lines. So with our alliums, our onions, our shallots, our garlic, our leeks, we'll feed them this way at least once every 3 to 4 weeks. You could do it as often as every 2 weeks, just depending on how hard you want to push them. We will do this, especially with our onions, right up to the bulbing phase. Once they start bulbing and that bulb starts getting larger, we'll cut off the fertilizer because that vegetative phase is over and they're in the bulbing phase now. So we'll fertilize right up to when we start seeing those bulbs enlarge. So I know that took a little while, 2 videos in fact, for me to explain something that really only takes about 5 to 10 minutes to set up and do. But I wanted to be as detailed as possible because we get a lot of questions on our videos and through our customer service line about just how the injector works and how it can work for their system. And so I wanted to explain all the ins and outs of how we set it up and how we get it going. If you're interested in our EZ-FLO injector or any of that onion fertilizer or our drip irrigation system, I'll put some links below so you can check those out. If you enjoyed this video, give me a big like, give me a big thumbs up and a share, and we will see you guys next time.